Good morning, Dr. Jones. Thank you so much for coming. I'm very excited. I've been a big fan for years now. I think during COVID, I first was introduced to your work, and yeah, you basically like converted me to Catholicism. So, thank you.
Well, good for you. Congratulations.
Cheers. But yeah, Dr. Jones, you were a former lecturer. You got your PhD from Temple University back when was it 78? Was it 73?
79.
79, sorry.
PhD in 79.
Yep, from Temple University, and that was in Philadelphia where you were raised. And then after that,
Yes.
you went to, was it St. Mary's University to lecture?
St. Mary's College. St. Mary's College in South Bend, Indiana.
Yeah, where you were then subsequently fired for protesting abortion or writing about abortion. And then
Right.
led you on this journey to kind of try and unravel the mystery of why you would get fired from a Catholic church for being against abortion. So yeah, we can start there. You've written like a number of books, which I've sort of like dipped my fingers into a bit, including Logos Rising, which is probably your most, like not most prevalent, but probably the most important book in regards to the rest of your collection. So yeah, I mean, there's so many things we could talk about. I've been like, fantasizing about this interview for years. So I'd like to start, if we could talk about mainly economics and then get into like sort of culture. And then I got a bunch of questions that are just all over the place there. And then at the end, we can get into sort of the racial question and the ethnic question, because I think that's the hottest topic right now. But I think we would disagree the most. So,
Okay.
so I'd like to ask you first with Logos. So Logos is probably the most important feature of your writing that you need to understand anything what you write about. And you basically describe Logos as the Greek word for logic, for word, order, and that it's basically, you believe that Jesus Christ is the Logos incarnate, come down to bring that order into the world, and that relates to the first line of Scripture, isn't it? That the Logos in our Logos. I can't say it as well as you can.
Anarcha ein ha logos. In the beginning, there was logos. Kai logos ein prosteon, and logos is with God. Kai logos ein theos, and logos is God. These are the three sentences that kind of changed the entire world. Based on Greek philosophy, what happened here is now St. John brought together Greek philosophy and the Hebrew understanding of history, and that's the marriage that created Christianity.
Right.
And that's where it started. It validated the Greek language. It validated because before the Hebrew scriptures were obviously written in Hebrew. It validated Greek philosophy because you can't have Greek philosophy without Greek language, and that would be the case for the next millennium, I would say. But certainly for the next 300 years, because the church fathers could not have come up to an understanding of the Trinity, for example, without the Greek language. The Latin fathers were present, but they were not participants in this discussion. You could not participate in this discussion unless you understood that there was a one-letter difference between homoousion, like in being, or one in being, and homoousion, which is like in being. If you didn't understand that, you weren't in the game. You couldn't participate in the discussion. So it was a turning point in human history.
Right, and you relate that to, so that's great. Thank you for that. And then another thing is the Jews. So can you define what a Jew is, Dr. Jones?
Well, in a sense, that's why I had to use the word logos when I wrote the Jewish Revolutionary Spirit, because I tried to extricate the Jewish question from the race question. And guess what? You're probably going to back to this at the end of the program, but we're right back at square one now, where the race question is driving the logos understanding out of the debate.
Right.
So I had to extricate it. So when people understood, it was, at first it was negative when the book came out. Everybody accused me of being an anti-Semite. But then when people started to understand what I was saying, then people started coming around, and I became famous as the anti-Jewish guy. which is okay with me because I think that's the position of Christianity and certainly Catholicism.
Yeah, 100%.
Well, at a certain point, the narrative got changed. And suddenly you weren't really serious. You couldn't be taken seriously as a critic of the Jews unless you supported Adolf Hitler. Now, wait a minute. Stop. Something happened here. Somebody hijacked the narrative here. And people started talking this way. And now we have the culmination of this. On Friday, you have Twitter releasing Kanye West's song, Nigga Heil Hitler, at the same time that the new Pope gets elected.
Yeah.
These are antithetical. These two issues are antithetical. And that's what the battle that's being fought out right now. I bet Henrik Palmgren, the Swedish guy, said Christianity is incompatible with white, I think he said white nationalism or something like that.
Yeah.
I agree. I agree. You're right. And I'm saying that's going to be the fundamental issue now because you have these people who are basically now the net result of this is that the whole purpose of my book was to discuss the Jewish question. And wait a minute, suddenly the Jew has become invisible once again because he's become a white guy.
Yeah.
Once again. This is the whole point of what I was trying to do to get back to the issue by getting away from the race issue. And now the algorithm, certainly on Twitter, is determined to bring it back into the racial narrative.
Yeah, 100%. And so in regards to like the Jewish question, that kind of stuff, you basically make a contrast between Logos and anti-Logos with the Jewish revolutionary spirit, as you called, being a sort of embodiment of this anti-Logos spirit throughout history and throughout culture and academia and that kind of stuff. But you also make a very important distinction. You do like kind of make a distinction between layman Jews and sort of like the rabbi class and the Jewish intelligentsia. And there are sort of just the layman Jews that follow along and don't really know about the Talmud or their own religion or their own history. So can you expand on that a bit?
Well, sometimes it comes down when you're discussing the gospel, especially during Holy Week. And the people will try, some people who are apologists for the Jews will try to say, well, it was the leaders, the Jewish leaders who did it. No, you can't be a leader without a follower. So it was the Jewish people who did it. Now that's different than every Jew. This is the terminology that St. Paul uses in 1 Thessalonians 2. The Jews are the people that killed Christ and are enemies of the entire human race. So the Jewish people are a political construct. That doesn't mean that every Jew at the time of the crucifixion supported his death. Blessed Mother didn't cry out, crucify him. So you have to make this type of distinction if you want to understand what's really going on here. And the distinction is in the Gospel of St. John, where the parents of the man born blind refused to speak out of fear of the Jews.
Yeah,
because the Jews threatened to expel from the synagogue everyone who said that Jesus was the Messiah. Well, I mean, technically, from a DNA point of view, everyone's a Jew in this story.
Right.
Everyone's a Jew except Pontius Pilate, as far as I can tell. Everyone else is a Jew. But so the division cannot be described genetically or racially or biologically. It just doesn't work. It has to be, the decision has to be, do you accept the Logos incarnate or do you reject the Logos incarnate?
Yeah.
If you reject the Logos, you're rejecting the order of the universe. That makes you a revolutionary, and that's what the Jews have been for the past 2,000 years.
Yeah, gotcha. And so you can hear me clearly? The volume's not too low?
Yes, I can, yes.
Some people in the chat just saying that's better. Okay, cool. Yeah, great. So that's a great place to start. So we've got Logos, we've got the kind of the Jewish revolutionary spirit. Just clarifying, we're sort of talking about this spirit as opposed to this thing. I think there's a racialist view of Jews all the time where it's like it's in their DNA that nothing can be done. And I do believe in your kind of worldview of like there is a Logos and that if you kind of every human has the capability to get in tune with the Logos at varying extents. So that's great. And then from there, I'd like to go on to like a little bit of economics. So barren metal. I loved your book about barren metal, and it's very relevant to myself and Australia at the moment because Australia's economy is going down, the toilet with what's going on, mainly because of usury. The big problem is usury. So I'd like to kind of again define some things. So you talk about the relationship between labor, usury, these sorts of things, with usury being compound interest, being a tool of enslavement, something that you can basically never pay off. And that's why you talk about back in the old days when the knights would come out with their gold. You talk about the jubilees, isn't it? The jubilees every 50 years, they'd have to clear the debt because
I think it's 25, but there was a jubilee year in the Bible.
right
Because
right.
a floating loan becomes unrepayable after around 70 years.
Yep.
You can plot the curve. It goes kind of like that. And then at 70 years, it goes whoop like that, and it becomes unrepayable. So the ancients, everybody knew this. As long as there was compound interest, people understood that you had to do something to prevent that from happening. And that was what the Jubilee year was, basically forgiving loans after 25 years.
Right. And you talk about a lot in general about labor being the real source of value, not money itself.
Yes, labor is the source of all value.
Yeah.
And so the book Barren Metal talks about this conflict between labor and usury. These are basically the two kinds of economies that you can have. You can have a labor economy, which is based on manufacturing, or you can have a usury economy, which is based on loans, compound interest, and all of the debt burden that creates.
Yeah.
That in the United States of America was the battle between Main Street, or primarily Detroit, and Wall Street.
Right.
And over this period of time, the Jews took over the country. One of the ways they did it was by allowing finance, allowing usury to destroy manufacturing. That was the tragedy of the leveraged buyout era of the 1980s, when the Reagan-Thatcher crowd allowed the Jews to come in and buy up companies, viable companies, load them down with debt, skim fees off the top, and then the company goes belly up, but they don't care because they're going to outsource the production to China. So we reached a point where we have basically no productive economy, or a very weak productive economy.
Yeah.
So Trump, I don't know whether you're following this in Australia, but Trump last week introduced tariffs, or maybe it was 2 weeks ago, as a way of solving this problem. I'm not sure it's going to solve this problem. Tariffs are necessary to protect nascent industries. If you don't have tariffs, and the classic example right now is East Africa, where the countries are being flooded by cheap clothing sent to them by the Jewish rag pickers from New Jersey. The countries there, Kenya, Tanzania, those countries, Rwanda, they all put tariffs on imported clothing, which is a good idea. You cannot start a cloth industry unless you keep these cheap things out. This was always the case with England. England could produce cheap cloth that could undercut anybody's price. And so the United States of America had to put up tariffs against cheap English manufacturers. Yeah. When Gandhi started campaigning for independence for India, he carried a spinning wheel around with him to symbolize the fact that the Indians are going to have to start making their own cotton cloth at this point.
Yeah, 100%.
So what happened is it was very successful in the United States, but by the end of the 19th century, it was too successful because you had created huge trusts, combines, monopolies, whatever you want to call them, that were just crushing the consumer. The railroad was a classic example. The farmer was dependent on the railroad to get his goods to market, and the railroad could charge whatever it wanted. It was a new technology, no one had regulated, and Theodore Roosevelt had to step in and break up this trust, the railroad trust, and say the government, which is the role of government, to basically keep these powerful players from dominating the market. Dominating, making their profit at everyone else's expense.
Yeah, well, that's basically what's happened in Australia. Is that we had our manufacturing industry in the 70s and all the way back. We so we're a very resource-rich country, and we used to have a massive manufacturing industry. We made Ford and Nissan, all these cars that we start to export around the world. And I think that's what really built the foundation of Australia's economy and made us a first world country and made us so prosperous. But then, yeah, in the 70s, we just had this this movement towards globalism with things like the Button Plan and these other kind of strategic political ideas where it basically just meant closing down factories, shipping it over to China and Japan, and then Australia got left with an economy that is basically just reliant on housing and university. That's about it. We have a resource-based economy now, and like you said, with the roads with people being able to charge whatever they want. In Australia now, people are charging whatever they want for houses, and the government is basically just complicit in this. Instead, they refuse to talk about demand at all. They refuse to talk about mass immigration at all. All they talk about is supply. And anytime it's brought up, they just talk about we need more supply. And what that really means in practice is just building high rises, building these dog boxes in the middle of the city to house thousands and thousands of immigrants. And we're here just in awe because it really is devious. And in my personal opinion, I think Australia is sort of ground zero in a way for what's going on around the world in regards to globalism and these sorts of things, because we've had the largest change in our population in regards to percentage-wise. And it's just not looking good. And everyone in Australia just we have no concept of the value of labour. We don't understand at all. We just see money and we see like the speculative return you get in housing as just a natural thing. And we see that, oh yeah, that's how you secure your retirement fund. And there's nothing wrong with that. Even if that means, owning 15 houses and eating 15 lots of rent from people who, are struggling to get by. It's really kind of a sick economy at the moment. But yeah, what would you say about because I remember I did ask you two questions once before in an X space. The first I'll get into later, but the second was the relationship between usury, rent, and sin. Because I was a bit confused because usury is a sin. And is the person taking the loan in sin at all? Or, because you talk about there being like the balance of power being out of whack, obviously, with a person taking the loan being in desperate need sometimes. So the person taking the loan isn't in sin. But then if the person that takes the loan then passes their usury onto another person via the form of rent, and especially if you times that by 10 people, is that not sin in itself?
It's not clear. What are you talking about? I don't get the connection between usury and rent. I don't understand that connection.
So the person that buys the home takes the loan from the bank. The bank gives the loan out with compound interest, that being usury. So the bank is in sin for giving the debt, right? For lending the debt as usury with compound interest. But then the homeowner then passes their debt onto the renter to pay off their debt. So it's I don't know, it's like a secondhand usury type of thing.
No, I don't think it's secondhand usury. I don't think you can have secondhand usury.
Right.
What you can do is you can gouge people for rent. The classic, like an example was 9/11 happens. Everybody's trying to get out of Manhattan, so they end up in Queens, and the owner of the motel charges them 1,000 times what it normally would cost. That's gouging. You can do that with rent, but generally, when it's rent, you can simply say, well, no, I'm not going to pay that. And I'll rent from someone else. Yeah. Now, if you control the market, then that could be sinful. The basic proposition is that anytime you have an economic exchange, you're going to have a stronger and a weaker party. And if the stronger takes advantage of the weaker, that would be usury. The classic example is obviously the loan, because of the mechanism of compound interest becomes unjust. But secondly, because there's no shared risk in a loan. And that's part of the sinful nature of usury.
Right.
So if you have a company and you sell stock in your company and your company does bad that year, well, you don't pay a dividend, which means that the stockholder is sharing risk, which means it's a legitimate type of investment.
Right, gotcha. So I'm just going to make sure my volume's right. Some people are just saying it's a bit low. Sorry if I can just up that up a bit. Where is it? Testing. Sorry, that should be good. Sorry about that. Yeah, right. So I do think kind of like there's a certain aspect of usury happening within our economy, because we're quite literally getting left with nowhere to live, and in Australia in particular, which is happening around the world. Obviously, it's not just us, but the homelessness is on the rise, and there's basically no option within our market, especially for young people, because the older generation is basically, what you do is you just reinvest the equity you've got from the returns you get on housing, and then you just buy it more and more and more. And that's basically what's happened in housing portfolios, and these sorts of things are just like what everyone drools over in Australia. So it's quite,
but the problem is when you, especially when you basically seduce young people into loans. The worst example in the United States is education loans, which cannot be, you can't default on an education loan. Donald Trump can default as many times as he wants because it's, that's normally what happens. So I had a guy from Wall Street tell me that the genius of the system, the American system, is liberal bankruptcy laws, which allows people to risk, take an investment, take risk, and then you're not going to be destroyed if you have to declare bankruptcy. Bankruptcy means basically creditor, okay, you're going to take a haircut. I don't know whether they use that term in Australia.
Yeah.
But basically, what's it going to be? I'll pay you 10 cents on the dollar. And the guy says, no, I want 12 cents on the dollar. And then you have this negotiation, but you're not going to pay full face value. Now, you have groups of people like vulture capitalists, it's a term here. And Paul Singer is one of them. He's a Jew who has this thing called Elliott Management. He buys up distressed debt. So he bought up distressed Australian debt, sovereign debt, and they had already agreed on a haircut of 10 cents on the dollar. And then he takes it to this corrupt judge in New York who says, no, he's got to have full face value, and basically wrecks the economy of Argentina. Because he was allowed to do this. This is a system that favors usury and doesn't favor or doesn't take labor seriously. That's the fundamental problem with the United States. It used to be labor had more power. It was never really strong here. There was big conflict in the 19th century over what type of wage the person should gain. Our new Pope took the name Leo XIII, based primarily on Leo XIV, took a name based on Leo XIII's encyclical Rerum Novarum, which was about the working man. And how do we get justice for the working man? The end of that, I think the last two words of that encyclical are rapacious usury. He condemns rapacious usury. On the other side of the coin, what do you need? You need a family wage. You need high wages. Because wages from the point of view of the economy are income. They're not an expense when you look at it from the big picture of the economy. And that's precisely the problem here as well. You get the impression that Donald Trump sees the economy as the preserve of his billionaire friends.
Yeah.
So
this is where you talk about things like so with just wages, you talk about economics being moral philosophy, and Adam Smith himself being a professor of moral philosophy. And then you get into a very interesting topic where you talk about Newtonian physics basically turning economics into inertia and motion, is it? Or so what's the gravity and inertia?
So gravity and inertia was basically the basis of Newtonian physics. He got it from Empedocles. It's basically love and strife are the forces that control the universe. So it's a pagan philosophy. It immediately eliminated God's providence from the universe. That was called deism, and so on and so forth. And then Adam Smith came along and basically, in spite of being a professor of moral philosophy, turned economics into pseudo-physics by doing the same thing. It's just that he called it self-interest and competition instead of gravity and inertia. But it's the same thing, because you get circular motion. And if you get circular motion, the machine runs all by itself, and there should be no intervention into the machinery, either from the part of man, or what you're saying is that God can't intervene into this mechanism as well. It's called deism, where Deus absconditus. He's out there somewhere, but he doesn't do anything that help me out. That's not Christianity. It's not Christianity.
And that's where I think we're very much we have, like, in Australia, this kind of this neoconservative ethos where morality and economics did not come into being at all.
Right.
Like even mentioning that, you would just be seen as some sort of like Puritan, some sort of stiff. But it is morality. You need to define who gets the money and what is the standard of living that you want for your country, and you need to pull the levers and kind of set things up to make sure you're guaranteeing that for your people. If you do care about your people, which obviously most countries don't anymore because they are kind of sort of anti-life, anti-human.
And they're also being bought off by rich Jewish politicians. IPAC, the American Israel Political Affairs Committee, Action Committee, whatever it's called, controls the entire Congress. Everything except for Thomas Massey. They control the entire Congress, and the Congress now votes for the interest of Israel and rich Wall Street Jews rather than voting, taking into concern the interest of the American people. It's a fundamental problem throughout the world because we don't basically have money running everything, and we don't have representative government as a result.
Yeah, 100%. And one thing I'd like to ask you, so you talk about, there's capitalism, there's communism, and then there's National Socialism. But in regards to, was it Rerum Novarum and Quadragesimo Anno, is that like almost a fourth position? There's almost like four positions, really, as opposed to, because people talk about the third position being National Socialism. They always talk about, nationalize the currency, make sure that labor is seen as the most important thing. They talk about like Hitler making sure that people could, if they had 3 kids, they pay off their house and these sorts of things. And they kind of they do put it on a pedestal, and it was a great economy. But when I looked into you, I started realizing, it's sort of just Catholic social teaching in regards to economics, but in a German National Socialist lens.
Well, so you had capitalism. Capitalism was so ruthless that it spawned a reaction. The reaction was socialism or communism, depending on how you look at it. And then that spawned a reaction because that was even more ruthless than capitalism. So at a certain point now, well, what's the solution? This is when the Catholic Church entered the picture and started talking about the Catholic alternative to both of these errors. It's simple as Jesus Christ is crucified between 2 thieves. One of them is a capitalist and the other one is a socialist or a communist. Okay, so what does this mean? It means, first of all, that you have to return it to moral philosophy. You have to understand that labor is not simply some type of commodity, which is basically the way it was treated, the iron law of wages. All of these things were being promoted by Bishop Kettler in Germany at the time. He influenced he influenced Rerum Novarum because of standing up for the working man. Basically, you can't treat labor as a commodity like coal or steel or something like that. Yeah. There's a price below which you cannot drive wages. Yeah. And that's precisely what the iron law of wages was saying. Just to keep it driving down, you have these people competing. It's like a race to the bottom. They're competing. The worker is outbidding or undercutting the other worker to get the job that he needs to support his family. Yep. This is ruinous. It's ruinous. And you have to have some type of regulation entering into the economy. So by the time of Quadragesimo Anno, you had what you would call the corporatist reaction, articulated by Amministratore Fanfani, the Italian. And you had people like Mussolini incorporating the corporatist understanding. What is the corporatist understanding? The good of the economy is the nation as a whole. It's not the billionaires so that they can make the rich richer. It's the good of the nation. The problem is when you implement this, you have to have a Catholic understanding of the big picture, and that's precisely what was lacking at this point in Italy, but even worse in Germany. Because now you've got this racial theory as the lens through which Hitler is seeing everything. And this is, by definition, is not really going to benefit the German people. Although the German people did benefit from it, but it's clearly not something that can be globalized or universalized, because you've got one group of people that is superior to another group of people. So it was the Jews in Germany, and Hitler wasn't around long enough to be able to reap the whirlwind on that. Well, he did. I mean, he died. But I mean, what the great achievement that Hitler had was hiring Hjalmar Schacht, who was a genius. Hjalmar Schacht saved the German economy in the 1920s because he was allowed to borrow gold to stabilize the mark. He deliberately allowed this mega hyperinflation to basically, because it wipes out debt. And as soon as that was taking place, then you bring in a stable economy, and sort of did it then. And then in the meantime, Hitler gets elected as doesn't get elected, but appointed as chancellor. And at that point, he's got to do the same thing. And as a result, he's got to do it without gold. And he did. Great accomplishment.
Right. So give me 1 second. Sorry, sir.
Go ahead.
Close that. Fix this. So, excuse me. Zoom does hate me. So hopefully that should be better.
You should have the full time here, because we paid for Zoom, so we shouldn't have to interrupt at 30 minutes.
No, the time's fine. So my camera just, for some reason, I use a DSLR, my setup, and it just doesn't like it. Yes, that's great. So we're talking about labor, and you're talking about the health of the nation being the main important thing. And it doesn't make sense, really, because if you think about, like what really matters in a nation, it's the labor being done for the people. If you're growing crops, that's labor to feed the people. If you're building a house, that's labor to house the people. So it's really just about how much labor is happening in your own economy, when the money is just a means of exchange to allow that exchange of labor to happen.
Right. What happened in America at this point is called identity politics, which basically there's no generic American anymore. We have problems here because it's an immigrant country. It's like Australia. So the Democrats come up with identity politics. In order to be a real American, you have to be part of these preferential groups, like blacks or like homosexuals or whatever, and everybody hated it. It created affirmative action, which is unjust. It created the white guy, basically, as the guy who never got the job, because you're demonizing a group of people. Race is always a form of demonization. It's always going to be a form of division. Right. So Trump comes in and he brings America first, and he's trying to bring all of the Americans together, bring back manufacturing. But the one exception to the rule is the Jews now. They have this constant privileged position, obviously manifested in Israel, but now the country is being pressured. All of these lackeys, these prostitutes who get elected with IPAC money, are now being pressured to create laws that will basically violate the constitutional guarantee of freedom of speech.
Yep.
So in a sense, he solved the one problem, the Democrat problem, the identity politics problem, but he still hasn't solved the other one.
Yeah. It's funny you mentioned that too, because in Australia we've got our very small Jewish community, even up in arms about freedom of speech over a couple of activists in Australia protesting against the Jews directly. And it is funny that even in Australia, where we barely have any Jewish population, there's maybe just over 100,000 people here out of 28 million, that even here they are, bringing in these anti-Semitic laws. They have an anti-Semitic task force. Right. They gave $40 million, might have been billion, no, million to the Jewish community to rebuild a synagogue. It's like, you don't need that much money to rebuild a synagogue.
No.
So it's absurd. It really is absurd.
This is the globalist American empire. I've been talking about how we have now the end of the Third Republic. You got 80 years of a republic. So the first one is 1781 to 1861, ends with the Civil War. Next one begins 1865, 1945, ends with World War II. And then you have the Third Republic. The founding myth of the Third Republic was the Holocaust. World War II was proof that Americans are wonderful people and we would never do anything bad. And if we invade your country and blow everything up, it's because we're trying to bring you freedom. And that's all based on the Holocaust narrative. And now we're entering a new era. Okay, it's 2025, it's 80 years, it's over, and nobody wants to give up the privileges that he got during that Third Republic, including politicians, generations of politicians. Germany is the worst example.
Yeah.
A whole generation of politicians who have basically internalized the command that the idea that Germans are bad people and they have to do everything that the United States or Israel wants in order to redeem themselves forever and ever, including the unending reparations payments. Yeah. Australia is going to be affected by this because you're basically part of the same Anglosphere and part of the same system.
Yeah, exactly. And in regards to that kind of stuff, so like the end of the Fourth Empire. So yeah, the Jewish Revolution.
The end of the Third Republic.
Third Republic. Sorry, my bad. Then yeah, you talk about the Holocaust narrative being sort of this like built up thing that started from was Elie Wiesel's Night as a kind of he basically took the Christ in Dachau story and then turned that into a Jewish story, which then got built upon and over and over and over. And then in the 70s in particular is when the Holocaust narrative really took off and people really fell into this guilt complex about it. Is that right?
That's right. It did.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, you're right. It began before that with American propaganda. The American propaganda machine got involved right at the end of World War II. Well, like when Eisenhower showed up at Ohrdruf concentration camp, there were dead bodies there. Obviously, nobody's denying there are dead bodies there, but the question is, how did they die? The real story is, well, there were no gas chambers at Ohrdruf. They died from diseases like typhus. And they died of typhus and typhoid because the Allies had been bombing the rail line, so food couldn't get in. They were bombing the water supply, so they couldn't have decent sanitation or decent water. And the Holocaust narrative was created to distract everyone's attention from the war crimes the Americans had committing during World War II. Eisenhower was very explicit about this, invited the New York Times, invited congressmen to come over there and put on a show for them.
Yeah.
And that was the beginning of the Holocaust narrative. And Hollywood was involved in the beginning. The guy who filmed the American version of Buchenwald was Billy Wilder, his name, a Jew by the name of Shmuel Wilder, who then became kind of a made man, famous in Hollywood after that because of that. The other guy was Alfred Hitchcock. He was a Catholic, okay, but Hollywood was basically, he did the British version of the Holocaust narrative, put it together.
Right.
But basically, it was a Jewish story, and the Jews then took that narrative, and nobody could stop them because they controlled Hollywood. There were people there. I forget the guy's name. One of the people who just, later on, he said, "Look, we wanted the Jews to create this as propaganda, but they took it and it got out of control. It took on a life of its own." Well, that's what I'm talking about. That's the Holocaust narrative. And as you said, there was a Catholic narrative that was based on Dachau that Father Lentz wrote about in Christus in Dachau, and that came out in 1955. And then 3 years later, Elie Wiesel hijacks the narrative. So, Father Lentz says we, the priests, were being punished for the sin of atheism. And then Elie Wiesel now, forget about Dachau, the only real concentration camp was Auschwitz. The only people who suffered were the Jews. And the moral of this story is God died at Auschwitz. So now you're promoting the very atheism that was the source of the problem.
Yeah, got you. Sorry, excuse me again. There we go. Sorry, it really hates me. Hates me today. Yeah, fascinating. And again, like, I feel like we could have a conversation about every one of these topics. They're so deep. A couple more before we get into like the real big one. There are a couple of little things that I like to talk about. So, as in regards to economics as well, labor and the importing of labor and the competition we're facing. For example, you talk about in Baron Metal, the peasant revolt being caused by the Black Plague or the Black Death, which kind of wiped out the majority of the working force in England and led to people having the leverage within the economy to actually go and challenge their oppressors. And I think there's a very strong relation to that in Australia, where Australians are getting beat over the head with this skill shortage myth. Skill shortage, skill shortage, skill shortage. And it's never been addressed to why there is a skill shortage. Perhaps maybe wages aren't high enough, and that's why people aren't going to these jobs. And the idea that of pressure, upward wage pressure from there being a lack of labour in the market is just oblivious to Australians. We just don't understand that, how to leverage for a higher wage in this country. We don't understand that a skill shortage.
You have unions? Are there unions there?
We basically have one union that's for the construction industry called the CMFEU, which is basically just in cahoots with the government, doing housing development. That's basically the only union we've got now. Labor was meant to be the party of the unions. Labor started from a bunch of unions back in the old gold rush times.
Right.
But it's just a mess. Like, people don't understand that, it's good to have a skill shortage in a sense, because then those people who are working there can negotiate for their conditions and their wages.
Well, you need if it's just the employer and one worker, the one worker's never going to have any leverage with them, because they'll just say, forget it, I'll hire someone else.
Yeah.
That was the problem of constantly driving. That's what drove wages down. The way workers were undercutting each other's position in the labor market. And the thing that did it was basically you have to have unions. And so the big breakthrough in unions in America was the sit-down strike in the automobile plants in Detroit, which has basically meant that the workers would not leave the factory. So it shut down production, and this put real pressure on the employer. Whereas before, if they walk around outside the building, the employer will bring in scabs. They'll bust the union that way. They'll bring them in, and then they'll be out of a job. So what happened by the end of the World War II, after World War II, Henry Ford III, the second. So he's the grandson of the founder of Ford.
Right.
Decided to sit down and negotiate with the UAW, United Auto Workers Union. And that led to an era of collaboration of the sort that was being promoted by Quadragesimo Anno. Quadragesimo Anno said basically labor and management should get together and work out mutually acceptable agreements. When I was a boy, my boyfriend and my friend's son used to go to these meetings that was run by a Jesuit by the name of Father Comey, who was trying to implement Quadragesimo Anno in actual factories in Philadelphia. That's the type of thing we have to go back to, because it's part of the English mindset. I'm tempted to say DNA, but that's wrong. The English mindset hates labor. I don't know what to say.
Yeah.
The English hate labor. It's just part of. I mean, in a sense, that's why you're an Australian.
Yeah.
Because basically it was just grinding the workers, and if the workers got uppity and wanted to do something, they wanted more pay, they'd ship them off to Botany Bay.
Yeah.
We have a song about the fields of Athenry.
Yeah.
I don't know whether you sing that, but we sing it up here.
I think I've heard of it. Yeah, you're right. So, there's two more things before we start getting towards there. So, you talk about urban renewal as ethnic cleansing, and I'm wondering what you think about the relationship between mass migration and ethnic cleansing. Do you think it's the same thing, basically?
Yes, absolutely. No question about it.
Yeah.
And it happened in Philadelphia when I was a child. So basically, after the war, there's a Gunnar Myrdal, the Swede, wrote a book on the race issue, and he said Americans are going to have to get used to social engineering. So the plan was already hatched out during the war. The elite, the WASP elite, decided that we're not going to allow any more of these Catholic ethnic neighborhoods because they were too powerful politically. And so what they did was they weaponized racial migration. So it wasn't from foreign countries. It was basically the blacks in the South who were down there picking cotton, and then they were suddenly brought up to Philadelphia. The Ford Foundation was doing this. It's in my book, Slaughter of Cities.
Yeah, you got the Ford brought up from the South, and then you talk about... Sorry, continue.
Well, they flooded Philadelphia with blacks from North and South Carolina. There was a black minister, Leon Sullivan. He was the agent of the Ford Foundation, and we didn't know nobody knew what was going on. I mean, suddenly the blacks start buying houses north of Lehigh Avenue in Philadelphia. Everybody panics, and everybody puts their house up for sale. Well, as soon as you do that, the price drops, and the real estate speculators come in and buy it up. It's called blockbusting. Yeah. And then they buy up the house and then they sell it to the Negroes for 5 times the price of what they bought it for.
Yeah.
So this is a classic example of this is a black-white confrontation that is really not a black-white confrontation.
Yeah.
Because it's being orchestrated by people who are just as white as I am or you are.
Yeah.
Okay, but they're behind the scenes.
So
Paul Ilversaker's a Norwegian. His family's Norwegian. He's whiter than I am, and he's the one who's breaking up these Catholic neighborhoods in Philadelphia and bringing the blacks in.
Gotcha. Okay, couple more things. I got a huge list. I won't go too crazy, but the relationship between Bauhaus, Walter Gropius, and like Jewish intellectualism. Is there much relationship between those? I know, sorry, it's a bit off topic, but I'm just thinking because in Australia we have like I have a theory that I'm trying to develop myself, which is that we have all these old, beautiful colonial buildings in Australia, right, in the cities that have been here since the 50s, before that. And every time I go into the city, I always look next to a colonial building, and there's this massive skyscraper, Bauhausian skyscraper, right next to it. And I have this theory that I'm trying to develop, which is basically that these Bauhaus monstrosities are forms of like psychological warfare against the old colonial history, the old empire, in a sense. And that they build these things to like mog or, overshadow these old colonial buildings. There's some in Brisbane, for example, where, they've got hotels on the top of colonial buildings, like these additions where they just chuck them on. And so I'm wondering, there's been a long history in Australia of like Jewish architects tearing down buildings or lobbying for certain kind of buildings, lobbying for these high rises. And I'm wondering if there's a relation that you found between Walter Gropius, Bauhaus, and the Jews.
Not Walter Gropius. Walter Gropius was a Prussian aristocrat.
Right.
Who, he came up with the design, the idea. He came up with the idea of the high-rise building. He called it a Wohnmaschine, a machine for living in. And he had a German design school in Dessau that was German. And he was driven out along with the Jews. Hitler didn't like Gropius, didn't like Dessau, didn't like any of that type of stuff, and drove him out. And so he ended up here. When Bauhaus broke up, he ended up here in Cambridge, Massachusetts, working at Harvard, and his counterpart, I forget the guy's name, but he ended up in the Soviet Union. And between them, they took over the world. Now, what happened after that was that there was a lot of destruction. I mean, basically all of Germany was destroyed, and they needed a cheap form of replacement buildings, and that's part of Bauhaus was proposed as the modern building, but it also was easy to throw up when in times of necessity when you had to rebuild. The Dreischeibenhaus in Düsseldorf and the Theaterplatz is classic Bauhaus, ugly. It just makes you depressed. Gropiusstadt in Berlin, named after Walter Gropius, another example of places that people don't want to live. Now, the Jews got involved in this later on. So I just did a review. You can go to culturewars.com and see my review of the film The Brutalist.
Yeah.
Now, brutalism is a later development of modern architecture. Some of the people like Kahn in Philadelphia, that guy who's the hero of the Brutalist is a kind of collage of a number of Jewish architects who came in late to the game and started building the brutalist version, which is a much more exaggerated form of modernism than anything that Gropius did.
So brutalism is where the connection really comes together.
I think that's the beginning of Jewish architecture.
Right.
And then you go from brutalism to deconstructionism, and you have a guy like Frank Gehry, which is not his real name. And that's the Jewish link, beginning with brutalism and then going to people like deconstructionists like Frank Gehry and Paul Eisenman and people like that.
Interesting.
I think that's the Jewish connection.
Okay, maybe they'll help me with my thesis of the demoralization thesis. That's awesome. And so, yeah, you talk about the Bauhausian philosophy basically being this hyper materialistic philosophy, where you say living machine. It's quite literally, it's a machine, a block, a piece of material they made to live in as a function, as opposed to a house made to raise a family and be a place of comfort.
I think the message here is that you are a cog in a machine. That's the message you get from these buildings. So when I wrote Living Machines, I went into the high-rise buildings in Chicago, the Robert Taylor homes.
Yeah.
They were built by Gropius. And you got all these sharecroppers. Remember racial migration, the ethnic cleansing? These are the blacks that are brought up from the South to drive the Catholics out of the South Side of Chicago. They grow up in shacks with one room, basically.
Yeah. Shanty
you go out and you sit on the porch, your feet are on the ground, and you play your banjo or whatever, and now you're stuck in a high-rise building, and it just disrupted black culture completely.
It's not natural.
It disrupted it completely.
It's not natural at all.
And so you had the rise of black gangs, for example. My friend Gloria takes me up. The door's stuck, the elevator, and I got primed. Finally opened the elevator door, and there's this gangster there standing there with his gold chains and his beeper. And he's more scared than I am because he thinks I'm a cop because I always wear a suit on the South Side of Chicago. But anyway, that's what it led to. You add one thing after another. You add, the disruption that always comes from migration. I'm talking about from their point of view. And then you add putting him in, warehousing him in high-rise Wohnmaschinen, and then you add the drug thing and the alcohol thing and the sexual. They wanted to solve the Negro problem with birth control pills. That was Margaret Sanger's Negro Project. It's a disaster, and we're reaping the whirlwind now ever since then.
Yeah, it's a tragedy. It's pretty rough. Okay, thank you. So yeah, another couple of things, and then we'll finally get to it because these things are very off topic. I asked you this in that X Space as well. Logos in Dionysian music. You read a book called Dionysus Rising, which is all about music, which I've read. I've read Dionysus Rising, Living Machines, a bit of Baron Metal, and I've watched all your lectures basically on YouTube, so I'm pretty well versed. But yeah, Logos in Dionysian music. There's two kinds of music as far as that book explained. There's Dionysian music, then Apollonian music. Apollonian music being music that kind of rises you up to the higher realms with string instruments, horns, brass being kind of the chest area you talk about, and then Dionysian music being more rhythmic music, drums, these kind of things that kind of invigorate the lower part of the body.
Right.
But within this Dionysian music, is there a logos? Like, is there meaning? Is there value to this kind of music? And in regards to things like Plato, where he talks about the modes and there being certain modes that
So the problem is with music is it can very easily arouse the passions, and if you arouse them and they get out of control, then that's bad music. That's bad music. And so there were two ways to do it. You can attack melody, which is the logos, basically the plot of music, which is what Wagner did in Tristano and Isolde, basically, you kind of, wait a minute, I lost sight of the melody. Where am I here? It's just we're going on and on through modulation, and it's kind of like you set off in a ship, and now you're lost at sea. because you modulated from one chord to the other, and you never got back to the beginning, the foundational chord, and so you lost contact with reality. So that's kind of lust,
Yeah.
like the sexual desire extrapolated ad infinitum to the point where you lose contact with reality. So that's one way he did it. And then Schoenberg picked it up, and he did Verklärte Nacht, and then took atonal music means, hey, you're not coming back. You didn't return to the dominant chord.
Yeah.
And then everybody got tired of it. And so George Antheil said, we all rejoiced when the jazz band showed up in Paris in 1919 because it was fun music. Now you can exaggerate it in another way. So we're not attacking melody, but you're using the rhythm to dominate the melodic line.
Yeah.
And this is symbolic of the passion's overwhelming reason. And that's the danger with that kind of music,
Right.
that type of Dionysian music.
So yeah, so it's rhythmic and dissonance at the same time, right? So you get like on one extreme you got atonal music, and then you go kind of jazz, and then would you say metal would be there afterwards, and you slowly start working?
Well, metal. So jazz went to rock and roll. Rock and roll is a very simplified form of jazz.
Yeah.
But the beat, the rhythm is what dominates that type of thing, as opposed to bebop, where you had Charlie Parker basically improvising to the point where I lost track of what he was doing. A man who has taken up this tradition is Gilad Atzmon. So you take a classic like Cherokee, everybody's played Cherokee, and you launch into the improvisation, and suddenly, I'm lost. I don't know where you're going. So I told him, I said, Gilad, I don't understand your music. And he said, that's okay. I don't understand it either.
Classic.
But this was that, in other words, it got so esoteric, this improvisation thing, that everybody got lost and they wanted a simplification, and that's where rock and roll came in.
Yeah, it was
there's a movie called Bird, I think Clint Eastwood did, about Charlie Parker, where he's going off and off into this esoteric realm, and suddenly you got the early rock and roll band, which was always had a saxophone as its lead instrument rather than guitar. And it's just stupid compared to, but he's too esoteric and this is too stupid. So you're always kind of going to the extremes and not hitting the happy medium.
Yeah, interesting, yeah. And you used to be a musician yourself, didn't you? Back before you left Philly, weren't you like part of the Jewish art scene? And you're kind of
I was part of the Jewish art scene. It had nothing to do with music, really. It was all painting and a lot of print. Philadelphia was famous for its printmakers.
Right.
So I worked for a printmaker by the name of Sam Mayton. He was a Jew. The art world was Jewish in Philadelphia, and that's when I became a Jew, because I stopped going to church and started thinking like a Jew at that point. I also worked at an art gallery, and so on and so forth. So yeah, but that was the music scene. I didn't really get into seriously until I went to Germany.
Right.
In '73.
Your friend was a serious musician, wasn't he?
Heiner is a serious musician. He was the guy who created the band. He was 9 years younger than me, and created this band. And he could. He was really good. I mean, I just loved playing with Heiner because everything I did turned out much better than it was by myself, because he could always enhance whatever I was doing.
Yeah.
You know,
as you can see,
and so.
I'm a musician as well, so like if you're ever in Brisbane,
Is that a bass there? Is that an electric bass that I'm looking at there?
My bass. That's my electric drum kit. I play a bit of everything though. So music, like I think part of my interest in you is you started talking about music so much, and so to continue on that a bit, I'm very interested because like this is very like metaphysical or whatever you want to call it, like philosophical, but like morality in music, right? We're talking about Plato. We're talking about like the modes being. There's certain modes that maybe you shouldn't touch. I don't know. You need to be wary of. But in regards to like writing music, so like back in my old days, I've written a lot of music. Oh, sorry. Hold on. That's a bad timing for that to stop. Excuse me. I've never liked Zoom. Surely. There we go. Okay, cool. So yeah, I've written lots of music in my time, and we talk about, there's musicians and artists talk about flow state all the time, right? Where you just kind of go into a flow state if you practice enough and you kind of meet the peak of like your skill and your knowledge, and you just sort of opens up. But when you go into that state, if you write a song, like how do you determine whether or not it's moral or not? Is it the language? Is it the tonality? Is it the rhythm? Is it the intention? I've always struggled with this question as a musician myself, whether or not, am I leaning into, is it a bad spirit that is coming in, or is it a good spirit?
If you're doing rock and roll, the main issue is the rhythm, because it's sensual. The rhythm is down here. The rhythm is from the waist down, and the melody is up here, and the harmony is right around here. Right. So if the one overwhelms the other, see, the trouble is, it wears out. So you don't have, you could listen to what? Little Richard now is not the same as listening to it back then.
Yeah, he does get old.
Bam, got a gal named Daisy. So what happened at this point was that white people started listening to Negro music. And Negro music was incredibly sensual compared to white music.
Yeah.
And so what you had these guys, these Englishmen like Eric Clapton, learning to play the blues, and the Rolling Stones did this type of stuff, and
Jimi Hendrix, all that coming in.
Jimi Hendrix, all these people. So it was revolutionary music at the time. Woodstock was a place where everyone celebrated Dionysian music. I don't know whether you saw the film, but Joan Baez showed up at Woodstock, and she sang the Ballad of Joe Hill, which was about workers' rights in the 1930s. This is not, you don't fit in, Joan. This is not Woodstock. Like a band like Santana, like came out of nowhere. Nobody knew who they were, and suddenly this is the type of music. This is Dionysian music. Yeah. So what is the point of Dionysian music? Well, if you're at Woodstock, you take your clothes off and take drugs. It enhanced that. It gave you the sense that was a possibility now. That's what the music did. So you're coming along, what, 60 years later or 50 years later? It's not the same world. And what happened over this period of time, you had to get more and more transgressive in order to cut on the cutting edge. And finally, it got so transgressive, nobody liked it anymore, and everybody stopped listening. So we're in a kind of crisis stage right now where the music that is pop music is terrible. I think it's all written by computers. I think it's all computer music.
It is getting there, and we could talk about AI, which is like, it's a huge thing. But I think it is sort of just like a pacifier at this point, pop music. Whenever I hear that someone's listening to pop music, it's just, they want to put the earbuds in and just tune out, and it's just the most repetitive. Like, I'm a rock guy. Like, I grew up on kind of grunge music and that kind of stuff. But at least that had at least it changed. At least it had like a chorus and a verse, and you had different chords, and there was a level of skill to it. But these days, the music that everyone's listening to is just trap beats, and it's just nonsense. So, do you know Rick Beato on YouTube?
No.
You would like Rick Beato. He's very interesting. He deeply analyzes music and sort of just breaks down music into its key components. I think you'd like him. So okay. So it's kind of just, it's the rhythmic aspect then. Great, because I'm a rock musician, so that's a bit
But there's a plausibility. What I'm trying to tell you is that this music lent a plausibility to action that would previously be considered immoral.
Yeah, right.
Music was really important in breaking down that barrier.
Yeah, gotcha.
And I'm talking about music in a mass situation where you're part of a big crowd, not just listening with your earbuds, but you're part of this big crowd, and suddenly a new world seems possible. That's what was going on in the 60s when I was, just
coming into it.
About to get married.
Yeah, lucky. You said that saved you, didn't you? But just like, sorry, we're about at the hour. Are you still got a bit of time? I know you usually just do a quick hour.
Usually, I just like to stick to an hour because I don't know what's going to come out of my mouth if I go longer than an hour. I might say something really crazy that I will regret.
Right. Okay.
But
well,
let's wind it up and ask me
Okay.
what the other questions.
I've got plenty of other questions. Let's do the race topic though, because that's the main debate that I wanted to kind of quickly talk to you about. Okay, so race is real to you? You believe race is a real concept?
Race is a social construct. It is a category of the mind.
But
It
you
is
believe-
based on a reality. There is a reality called phenotype,
Yes.
which is what race is based on. So you look, the way you look and the way I look is not the way Africans look. So there's a phenotype. That's a category of reality.
Right.
The category of the mind called race puts values, imposes values on things like your nose.
Right.
Your nose has no value. Your hair has no value. There is no moral imperative with that. But that's precisely what race does. Race is a social construct that it's always black and white. It privileges one group at the expense of the other. So it's a social construct that is created for exploitation and oppression.
So you think that
Now, over this period of time,
the word race always has connotations to value? You can't separate the two.
look, now there's another issue because there are equivocations with race. So if you go back to the 19th century, people talked about the German race and the Irish race. They don't talk about that anymore. That's an ethnic group. So in that time, it meant ethnic group. Now it means phenotype. And there's all kinds of people out there who are trying to, sleight of hand, equivocation. I got nothing up my sleeve here, but I'm doing something over here. And they switch the meaning in midstream.
Gotcha.
So if you're saying phenotype, yeah, I agree. There's a phenotype. If you're saying IQ, we're entering dangerous waters here because as soon as you get to something like IQ, you're smuggling in good and bad. If you have a low IQ, you're a bad person.
Yeah.
This is.
Yeah. The value comes into it. And as far as I understand, you don't believe the IQ test. I watched your interview with the Jolly Heretic, where he sort of grilled, kind of pushed you a bit on the IQ question, whether or not IQ is a good measure of someone's overall intellect in regards to music.
But first of all, even if it were a good indication of intelligence, which I dispute, why it's not an indication of moral worth?
No, of course not.
And immediately, as soon as you say shit like, the average IQ of a Haitian is 75. Did you know that? That means they're bad people. That's why you're saying that. You're saying that. This is the sleight of hand that always gets involved in the race question. And so I have to get into.
I think it's not so much a sleight of hand. It's just because a lot of these populations are being introduced to first world countries, and we're seeing a very clear disconnect in our culture and our understanding of how things work.
All right, if you want to talk about weaponized migration, I wrote about it in Slaughter of Cities. I was ethnically cleansed by black people.
Sure.
In Philadelphia. So I know what it is, okay? But that's something else, again. And then secondly, if you're going to talk about weaponized migration, who's responsible for it? I just got a guy in California who's blaming the Catholic Church. I said, wait a minute. Do you ever hear of Alejandro Mayorkas? He's not a Catholic. He's a Jew. He was head of Homeland Security. He's the one that opened the borders to thousands, hundreds of thousands of people coming across the border because he was head of the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society.
Yeah.
And they use that to basically dilute. They are trying to destroy the America as a Christian population or traditional, whatever you want to call it. They're trying to overwhelm that. They've been doing this forever. The Javits Emanuel Sellers immigration bill in the 1960s was exactly planned to do that.
Of course. So
Why do these people pretend that I never said these things?
No, I
when
know
I'm
you said
against weaponized migration, I've said it repeatedly.
But I'm aware. So then, okay, we go from there on. Then, so your main crux is the problem with the term white because you see it as it's a social construct. You talk about what's his name? Noel Ignatieff talking about how the Irish became white, and you say that basically because of that idea that the identity of white only came from the blacks, Southerners coming to the north, that no one really identified with it. But as an Australian, our history, I've been looking more and more into this, and the term white Australia from before Federation, before 1901. I'm talking back in like the 1880s, maybe before that, the idea of white Australia really came up. It was really one of the main driving forces towards Australia federating and becoming Australia.
Because you're a British colony.
Right.
And there's an Aboriginal people there, and so now you have to introduce white to justify your bad treatment of the Aborigines.
Yeah.
That's exactly. There's no difference between Australia and Virginia. Absolutely
Right.
no difference whatsoever.
Right.
It's just except the people. So in Virginia, you had the Indian, okay, who had to be driven out, but then you bring in slaves from Africa and you bring in slaves from Scotland and Ireland.
Yeah.
And they joined together in Bacon's Rebellion, and because they had a common interest, and the Virginian oligarchs were afraid of it, and so they created white and black to
Sure.
divide the workforce,
Sure, but I guess
to divide and conquer.
Sure, but I guess the point I was trying to get to is like, for example, we had the Irish and the English coming to Australia, and one of the things that united them and made them kind of sort of not surrender their ethnic identity, but put aside their ethnic identity, was becoming white in a sense and embracing the white
Right.
Australia policy and embracing white Australia. So I don't know. I just think this idea that uniting under the banner of white is some sort of like way of playing into the enemy's hand, as you put it. You say it plays into the Jewish media narrative of white versus black, of racial tensions. When to me, like as a young person, young white person who's kind of aware of what's happening in the UK or Canada or Ireland and the weaponized mass immigration, when we use the term white, we're just referring to Europeans. Like we just say, it's more just like it's a colloquialism and a sort of rhetoric device to get our point across that these people are being ethnically cleansed. And if I said,
Which you mean the Anglo-Irish Australians are being ethnically cleansed by migrants now coming in from other countries?
Well, yes, but I'm talking about as a whole. Like when we talk about the white replacement, for example, we're referring to all these countries, referring to the UK, Ireland, Australia, Canada, all these countries where it's a mix of European people. We can't say, if I said, it's the Celtics being replaced, it wouldn't make sense. If I said it's the Anglos being replaced, it wouldn't make sense. So I think the term white is more of just a colloquialism that we use to bring the argument, to bring the topic to a base level so that we can all talk about it.
Well, the issue in the United States was basically like me. I'm half Irish and half German. So what does that mean? And when you have mixtures like this, white becomes a kind of convenient way of talking about these people who are mixed race Europeans.
Sure.
Okay? But it gets weaponized. You cannot have white without black. Okay? That's why it's ludicrous for these Swedes or Norwegians to say they're white. You can't be white unless there's a black person around.
Sure, but
black, and I'm saying once you play into the racial categories, okay, you're playing into conflict.
Sure.
And the conflict will be manipulated. The antithesis of this is Catholic countries, where they did not have racial conflict. What you had in French Canada and also in Mexico and South America was intermarriage. Intermarriage is the rule in Catholic countries. Racial conflict is the rule in Protestant countries because Protestants are state churches and they do not have the concept of a universal church.
Sure. So your old statement, for example, in Australia, where we've got almost a million Indians in Australia now, we've almost got a million Chinese. The racial tensions are already here, and the Chinese see us as white, the Indians see us as white. And so I just feel like if we were to collectively identify as Catholic and go up to the Indians and Chinese and say, hey, listen, what we should interbreed, we should, just accept each other here. It doesn't make sense to me. And it's also a fact of
wait a minute. What doesn't make sense to you?
Are you saying that, for example, in Australia, let's just stay with Australia for my sake, what would be your statement going forward? Would you say that these populations just have to work with it? Because a lot of people my age, we quite frankly want to reverse some of the damage done by this weaponized mass immigration via deportation schemes. But the problem is that when we talk about kind of trying to fix the demographic issue, we're met with animosity from the state and these ethnic groups together, working together, who attack us. And I don't know, the idea of me just saying, okay,
What's that got to do with race? What's that got to do with race?
Well,
it could be this. It could be this. What you're talking about is competition between different ethnic groups, which was the de facto situation in America, even among Catholic ethnic groups.
Sure.
Some Catholic ethnic groups did not get along with others. The Irish and the Italians did not get along as well as the Italians and the Germans, for example.
Yeah, sure.
But if you're talking about Catholic principle, you're talking about a system that is based on charity and reconciliation and nonviolence.
Sure.
If you're talking about the Protestant racial system, you're talking about a system that's based on conflict and favoring one ethnic group over another. So
sure, okay.
The conflict is baked into this racial system, and you'll never get over it.
Sure. Well, let's use the word ethnicity then. So, how would Australia deal with its ethnic struggles and its ethnic demographics? Like, do you think they should just kumbaya, try and come together and just say, "Hey, it's all
kumbaya"?
Good. You know what I mean? Like they come here.
Next thing you're going to do, you're going to call me a boomer, right?
No.
Boomer.
But I'm just
what I'm saying that these groups should collaborate.
Right.
I'm saying that if you've got these people who are fomenting conflict, you're going to have conflict, and it's got basically nothing to do with race. Especially if you're talking about Indians and Chinese.
Sure.
The classic racial trajectory is black versus white, and it came about in Virginia.
Sure.
Now,
I know.
Before, just to give you background. When Cromwell went to Ireland, he treated the Irish as if they were black.
Sure.
He had this ferocious animosity against them because they were Catholic. Because Cromwell is the manifestation of the Jewish revolutionary spirit.
Sure.
He thought he was Joshua. He thought that the Irish were Amalek. And then when the Puritans came over to this country, they thought the Indians were Amalek. The problem here is this Judaizing Puritan religion.
Sure. But,
Protestantism. Okay. That's the problem.
Sure. But if we use the ethnic definition, the ethnic title, do you think that ethnic groups such as the Anglo-Saxon and Celtics in Australia have a right to try and maintain their ethnic majority in the country that their ancestors built?
Well, who am I to say whether they have a right or not? I don't deny people their rights. If it's a group, you organize politically, and then you try to better the position of the group you're in. Okay?
Sure,
I'm saying, what did I say at the very beginning? You have to have all of the national economy in mind when you have an economic system. The good of the nation is the purpose of the economy. And I'm saying the good of the nation depends upon the unity of the people who make up the nation.
Sure.
So if you have an immigrant society where you're bringing in people from various places, there's going to be problems. There's problems in the United States because at a certain point, everybody's coming in with a new idea. You can't even talk to each other.
Yeah, I agree.
America was a country where you had cities where even if you were Catholic and you were Polish, you couldn't talk to the Catholics who were German.
Sure.
And there was animosity between Catholics and Germans in the old world as well.
Yeah, I understand. But
what do you want? Do you want a system that emphasizes conflict?
No, but my point is,
makes one group preferred over the other, or do you want a system that emphasizes charity and reconciliation?
Well, obviously, charity and reconciliation. But my point is, you're talking about a collaboration between all these ethnic groups, right, in Australia, as being the ideal. That's your position. But how can we collaborate if my end goal or my people's end goal, our ethnic group's end goal, to clarify, is to eventually send these Indians and some of these Chinese back home? Like, if that is genuinely our interest as a country, as a nation, to preserve our kind of ethnic dominance and our ethnic heritage, not just dominance, right? It's like, it is our history, it is our country. How can there be collaboration if the end goal is to send them?
Are they citizens? Are these Indian citizens?
I mean, some, yes.
Well,
Yeah,
you
so-
can't send them home then because
Yeah.
they're Australian citizens. If they're
Sure.
not citizens, well, yeah, you can deport them because they're not citizens. That
Sure.
becomes the crucial issue.
But
As far as
part-
I know, I know an Indian who's living in Australia now. We're going to meet up in Kirk for our conference. I don't. It depends on whether this is a legal issue.
Sure, but
If
the
you're
thing
if
is,
you're a citizen, you have a right to stay in the country and you can't be deported. If you're not a citizen, you can be deported.
sure, and that's
You can ship them off to Nauru,
yeah.
the world's original shithole country, where they can eat fried chicken for the rest of their lives.
Sure.
Isn't that your penal colony now? Isn't it Australia's penal colony?
Something like that. Yeah, something like that. Okay, we're getting somewhere. So I agree with you to an extent that my general kind of prescription is we need to send back the temporary visa holders and the students who are not citizens. But the problem with that is this citizenship stuff has been weaponized as well. Like we've got our politicians in Australia handing out 50,000 citizenships at once, just like writing a piece of
Right?
paper.
That's a problem.
And so-
That's a problem.
It's like, okay, so how do
What's
we...
race got to do with this? This
not
is
pla-
a problem.
okay,
It's not. It's
no,
not a racial problem.
Okay, ignore
it's
race,
a
ignore
political
race.
problem.
Okay, but it's an ethnic problem too. It's an ethnic demographic problem as well, right? Because these ethnic voting blocks are starting to form in Australia, and then they are voting like a lot of people in Australia think Labor got in because of the ethnic voting blocks that have come about. Who basically 80% vote for Labor, 80% vote for the left wing party, and then the working class Australians, like the Anglo-Saxon Celtic people, we're here like, oh, we're losing our voting power. We're losing our power in the country. And it's like you're telling us to go and meet these people halfway when it's like they are now acting for their own ethnic interests, which are against our ethnic interests. And like these people, like, they're devout Hindus, they're devout Muslims. Like the conversion process takes, how long for each individual. So I just don't, practically speaking, I'm just like, left in awe of like what to do with this.
All right. So you're talking about the problem of citizenship.
Yeah, and ethnic demographics. Ethnic demographics.
This problem, the problem. No Jew was allowed to be a citizen in any country in Europe until Napoleon changed that.
Sure.
And that had serious consequences to this day, because I don't think Jews can be citizens. I don't think they can ever represent the interest of let's say, the American people. And the Biden administration was proof of that. And to some extent, the Trump administration is proof of that. Okay? So if you want to deal with the citizen issue, okay, deal with the citizen issue. If you want to deal with the immigration issue, deal with the immigration issue.
Yeah, but
right?
these are two issues, but yet you're ignoring the ethnic demographic issue, which is that we've got these large voting blocks already here, which are against us. Like, it's not about their citizenship. It's not about the fact that they mass migrated here, which has already happened. It's the fact that on the ground level, we've got these ethnic voting blocks who see us as white, and even if we don't call ourselves white, even if we called ourselves our ethnic names, even if we ignored race completely from the discussion, just said, no, we are Anglo-Saxon Celtic people that have come together as Australians, you can't get away from this ethnic demographic problem, which is that they're here and that they are now basically fighting against us. They're excluding us from our own economy. I mean, you try and apply for jobs at certain Indian-owned businesses, you won't get a call back.
Do you have a situation in Australia like the one in America where you have to check off the block and says that you're white?
Well, we have Aboriginal.
When you're applying for a job?
No. So we don't have, we have like Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander. It's either you're Aboriginal or you're Australian, and Australian means everything. Australian means everything and nothing at the same point, because they've taken it from an ethnic identity to a legal category of citizenship, which is what you're kind of talking about. And Australians like myself, we feel kind of insulted by that, because they have turned our nationality into just a piece of paper, which they're now handing out like...
If they turn your nationality into something like white, where you have to check off that box, which is what happened in America, you'll lose.
Yeah.
Given the situation, the same way before, if you had to check off black, you would lose. You wouldn't get the job. They would discriminate against you. I'm saying this type of discrimination is programmed into the black-white dichotomy, which is why it's not a good idea. Shouldn't do that.
Okay, so yeah, it's your main problem is with the category, the labeling of the problems, as opposed to the actual.
And so, if you don't like Indians, don't let them into the country. And the politicians who let them in should be driven out of office.
No,
But once they're in and once they become citizens, then technically, what are you going to do? You can't get rid of them. They have every right to be there as much as you do.
Well, that's my point. And my problem is, like, the reason people are so, I think, getting so angry or frustrated with your position is because they want a solution to this problem. They see that their countries have been completely changed, and they say that, you know, the idea of just uniting as Catholics to try and deport a bunch of people doesn't make sense, really. So we just.
You know, a big propaganda campaign going on right now is the South Africans that have now been admitted into the United States as immigrants. It's all over Twitter. They're praying this up. Maybe because Elon Musk is a South African.
Right.
Okay. What is the source of that problem? It's the racial dichotomy.
Yeah.
And they're still, so they come in, the Boers go there, the Dutch are there, the English conquer the Boers, and then they create this, as they did in every single colony, this black-white racial dichotomy to basically divide the population. And now, once it gets institutionalized, now the tables get turned, and now it's the white people who are being discriminated against as opposed to the blacks. I'm saying the problem is the black-white dichotomy. That's the problem. It always leads to conflict.
Sure. I mean, yeah, but I mean, so what's the ideal, again, so just to clarify what your ideal solution would be for a case like Australia, it would be a unity amongst all the ethnic groups to then aim at the Jews and criticize them for their...
Okay, if you're all in the same country, you're going to have to come to some type of unity of what it means to be an Australian. I just did a book on American identity. We had to come up with some type of understanding of what American identity means, which means it's this type of behavior and not that type of behavior. And the fundamental problem in American history was the introduction of the Jews.
Sure.
Who basically undermined, first of all, weaponized. There was always a conflict, a racial conflict. But that was Jews too, because it was Puritans, it was the descendants of the Puritans who were Judaizers who weaponized the thing and led it into the Civil War.
Sure. But part of a national identity is the ethnic makeup and the ethnic demographics of that nation. Like, it's not just a thing about, we agreed upon it, like we all signed a piece of paper as Indians, Chinese. Like, there is an ethnic component to a national identity. Like, how would you define an Australian? Is it just the citizenship?
Criminals.
Yeah, but, you know, like, how would you ethnically describe an Australian?
Well, obviously, most of the Australians are Catholic because they were the ones who were being deported. You were all deported. You were all turned into criminals because of economic injustice and shipped off there to the other end of the world.
But when you say that the majority ethnic identity was Anglo-Saxon Celtic, it's a makeup of that. Which came together.
I think it's Celtic. Yeah, it is. Absolutely.
Well, I think majority was Protestant. It was mainly Protestant in Australia.
I've heard the opposite. I've heard the majority of Australians were Catholic.
Right.
I've heard the exact opposite.
Interesting.
Which would make sense if most of them came from Ireland, then most of them would be Catholic. So
I think most
depends on what the ratio was.
Most came from England, and then there was a lot of Scottish Protestants as well, and then we had a bit of Irish, and there was a bit of tension there. But then because we had all the Chinese from the gold rush in Darwin competing with the gold miners, they basically it was basically kind of a racialist alliance in a sense, or an ethnic alliance against the Chinese, which led to federation, which led to the Australian identity being formed as like an ethnic identity. Like there was
right.
And then when Australia started bringing in immigrants, they were saying we wanted to defend white Australia. Basically, I think it was like 14 of our first prime ministers all explicitly defended white Australia. And when they explained themselves, when they explained what does that mean, it was of suitable European descent. So they would go to Britain and they would aim for an ethnic group, which was the Anglo-Saxon Celtics. They would always aim for those first. And then after generations, the European sort of thing, the suitability of Europeans kind of got bigger and bigger, and it incorporated Greeks, and that's when we started getting a lot of problems with our national identity. But it didn't happen until we started diversifying our ethnic majority. It didn't happen until that. Like we know what we are, and I think an Australian, in my opinion, is someone that's Anglo-Saxon Celtic heritage.
Okay.
And
Samuel Huntington said an American is an Anglo-Protestant.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's not adequate. It's not adequate. First of all, it excludes all the Catholics who have been here for a long time. But let me just back up here. The main conflict in America, in the Catholic Church, was between the Irish and the Germans.
Mm-hmm.
Who was going to control, who was going to create the persona, who was going to get the jobs at Catholic University and so on and so forth, who was going to set the pattern for assimilation. It was the Irish versus the Germans. Now, from a phenotype point of view, they are indistinguishable.
Mm-hmm.
You can't tell them apart, and that's the basis of race, which is phenotype. And so what I'm seeing here is this attempt to bring in this fantasy of race as somehow something that's going to solve this problem. You're not going to solve the problem of ethnic conflict by racializing it. It's not going to work.
When we refer to white, we're not, I think, in my opinion, it's not referring to this old racialist ideas. It's just referring to European. We're just talking about, hey, all the Europeans, all the white countries are getting replaced and ethnically cleansed. That's all we're really referring to. And I think the idea is that in a lot of these countries, because like you look at the numbers in India or China, right? There's like 1.5 billion people. And with the rate of migration that's happening right now, if it keeps going in Australia, for example, which is like 700,000 per year, 500,000 people per year, we're going to become minorities in our own country. So there is this kind of globalist identity forming, which we just use the word white to describe, because I think everyone, basically all the white people in all these countries, are scared of being the minority in their own countries.
Why are Indians being chosen? Why are the Indians and the Chinese being favored in terms of migration?
Well, in Australia, it's because they're so close and there's so many of them, and we sort of have our government, Jews, and our ties to their governments and labor.
They're cheap labor. They're cheap labor.
Yeah.
That's exactly the whole point of India and China. So it's got nothing to do with race. It's got to do with cheap labor.
Yeah, but the consequence is that we have these ethnic demographic groups now. And again, I'm not using the word race. I'm just saying that we use the term white as young people, white people, to just identify this problem that around the world we are experiencing the same phenomenon.
I'm saying if you use the word not white, you're not identifying the problem.
Right.
This is what I tried to say to my Irish friends.
Right.
Okay? As soon as you say, why can't you defend your country, the borders of your country, by saying, I'm Irish? Why can't you do that? You have every right to do that. Ireland has a right to protect its borders. Every country has a right to protect its borders.
Yeah, but
as soon as you identify as white, you're going to lose.
Yeah, but
because the elites will now employ the racial narrative to destroy you, because as soon as you say you're white, you're a racist, and racism is wrong. It's immoral, and so therefore you lose.
But
you see what I'm saying here?
Yeah, so there's the crux. Yeah.
What does white have to do with Ireland? Irish are not white until some black guy shows up and they make the comparison of phenotype.
But all it is just like the most basic observation of reality. It's just the most cooked down, which I agree to you means that it can be misconstrued, right? It can be turned into something evil or good, depending on where you stand. But it's just this general idea. So
what's the difference between being white and being Catholic?
Oh, well, I mean, so yeah, Catholicism has a creed. It tells you how to act. It gives you morality.
That's right. It does.
Yes,
and what's the white creed?
Yeah, I agree with that.
What are the 10 white commandments?
I agree with that. Yes, I understand your point.
So what that means is that the oligarch can then create the categories that determine whether you're white or not.
Sure. But I think
they control you. As soon as you say white, there's no content to that thing other than the shape of your nose, which means that they can say, oh, you have to act this way. I mean, white people are smart, high IQ, blah, blah, blah. It takes control over it in a way that if you say I'm Catholic, no, that doesn't work.
But I think that power is dying.
The whole point of what happened in Ireland was to deny the people their Catholicism, and they hornswoggle them into doing this by getting them to pass abortion, gay marriage, which wrecked their Catholic identity, separated from the Catholic Church. And when they became separated, then they could apply the category of white to them so they could destroy them. It's a trap. It's a trap.
I know, but I think that power is dying. I think on the internet now, with the freedom of speech that's coming out, with the war in Gaza, with everyone now criticizing the Jews so openly, I think that narrative is just falling apart, and anyone on the opposing side of my ethnic group who is using the term white to demean us is exposing themselves as sort of a Jewish proxy warrior. So I don't think that
That's right.
I don't think it holds the same weight anymore.
If you identify as white, you become a bad person, and the Jew becomes invisible.
Yeah.
That's the problem with this whole racial narrative. That's the purpose of it.
I understand, but I think that I don't think it's as detrimental as you make it out to be to identify as white collectively, for the sake of conversation, for the sake of rhetoric, and then as people delve into it a bit more, you kind of explore it a bit more. For example, I'm not a fool like the neo-pagan, this kind of stuff. I do agree with you that you need a creed, you need a way to have a unified morality, which is Catholicism. But I'm just saying, for the point of discussion, I don't think white is too bad of a identifier. But anyway,
okay, in some abstract world, there's probably a way in which you can use white in some type of innocent fashion that will be purely descriptive phenotype, but that's not the world we live in, and that's not why you are being pressured to identify as white.
Sure.
It's identity theft. It's I have guys, this guy, Dave Riley, Nick Fuentes, these are people who are trying to get Catholics to identify as white to harm them.
Sure.
It's identity theft.
Yeah.
It's identity theft. And that's the people who are orchestrating this know that.
Yeah.
And
I understand.
so
I understand.
They're trying to lure you into a trap like Charlottesville. Yeah, it's America. I have a right. I'm white. And they got lured into a trap because white is a trap.
But I think the more the oligarchs lean into this anti-white rhetoric, the more it kind of wakes people up to the ethnic cleansing that's happening. I think it's hard. How do you explain, for example, in Australia, right? If Indians, Chinese, Anglo-Saxons, if we're all Australian nationally, then like bringing in Indians and Chinese isn't ethnic cleansing, because you're just bringing in more Australians, technically speaking. You know what I mean? So it's
no, it doesn't. No, it doesn't work, because they are coming from an alien culture, and if you bring in large numbers of them, they will not assimilate.
Well, that's what we've got.
The Roman Empire had a process of assimilation that was very clear. If you were a German and you wanted to become a Roman, they would send you to Syria, because then you couldn't talk to the natives. Now, what happened was that the Germans, the Goths, decided, hey, we're all coming in. We're all going to cross the Danube. And that was the end of the Roman Empire.
Well, that's what's happening.
The beginning of the Gothic Empire.
That's what's happening in Australia, though.
Obviously, that's a problem, whether it's Chinese or Goths or whatever problem it is. If you have so many of them that they will not assimilate, then you've got a problem.
Well, that's what's happened. Like,
why is that? What does that have to do with being white?
No, it's more just.
Were the Goths white or were the Romans white?
No. But
which group was white?
Again, it's a colloquialism. It's a modern colloquialism to have the conversation in a simple way without doing this, explaining every ethnic identity in detail in their history. But that's what's happened in Australia, though, Dr. Jones. Is we've got 30% of our population is now born overseas, and it's probably more that have been born here too. So we're basically there. We're basically at a point where they're not assimilating. They're forming ethno communities, ethnic enclaves. And we're just trying to like identify as something, but we're not allowed to identify as Australian anymore, or our definition of Australian, which is Anglo-Saxon, so Celtic. So
I'm saying the same people who will not allow you to identify as Australians will want you to identify as white, because you lose as soon as you do that.
But there is an
because
ethnic component.
White is always a value judgment.
Sure.
Either good or bad. Sometimes, in the beginning, white was good, black's bad. Now black is good and white is bad. There's always a value judgment associated with white, which is not associated with an ethnicity.
Right. Okay. So
ethnicities are by definition neither good nor bad. They simply are.
Okay. So how would you define my stance? I call myself a Christian ethno-nationalist. Australian Christian ethno-nationalist. Is that coherent?
Yeah.
That's okay?
Yeah.
Okay,
Yes.
that's good then. Okay, I think yeah, we sort of disagree on the ethnic ties to nationality and identity a bit, but we had a good discussion. We should pack it up because I have held you up for over an hour and a half, an hour 40. It's been a great conversation. A couple of last questions going further into the future. What do you think about things like smart cities? Actually, this refers to migration. The Kalergi Plan, the World Economic Forum. These sorts of big kind of picture the fourth industrial revolution, the big future that we're looking at on a global scale. Loaded question. Sorry to end on.
Why do you ask me these big questions at the end? Why don't you ask me these quick questions at the beginning?
I would ask you all these. I can ask all these questions.
There is such a thing called weaponized migration that is going across on the world. The point that I'm trying to make about the economy is there is nothing larger than the national economy. Mm-hmm. As soon as you start talking about an international economy, you're talking about the exploitation of wage differentials. That's all that means. Yeah. And that's not to the benefit of the people in the country. So you have to focus this on a national economy and a national identity. The question is, do you have a national identity? This is the big question in America. Do we have a national identity here? I don't know. It's up for grabs. It was destroyed. They tried to shoehorn everybody into one that didn't work, and now they had. The thing that strikes me the most is like the Pope. Is he an American? He doesn't look like it. He speaks perfect Italian. This is the type of the emergence, maybe the emergence of the Fourth Republic of a new kind of American. Maybe that's what this is talking about.
Interesting. Okay, great conversation. Thanks so much for coming on again. It's been a pleasure.
Okay.
It's been a dream come true. Yeah, you can find your books at fidelitypress.org, I believe it is. That's where you can buy all your books. Plenty of books, amazing books. And you're releasing, what's the title of your new book on American Identity?
Walking with a Bible and a Gun, The Rise, Fall, and Return of American Identity.
Awesome. And when should that be released?
Good question. We're at the printer. I'm still waiting for a delivery date.
Okay. I look forward to it. Okay. Thanks again for coming on. God bless.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Bye. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.